The last thing my father said to me before I left his house wasn't goodbye. It was get out and don't come back until you apologize to your sister like you mean it. He didn't shout it. He said it with the kind of cold finality that belongs to a man who believes he's already won the argument. His hand was still on the doorframe, blocking my path back inside, as if I might try to push through and contaminate the family peace he'd worked so hard to restore. In that moment, something inside me went still. Not broken, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you realize the people who raised you never actually saw you at all. I picked up my bag from the porch, turned toward my car, and understood with perfect clarity that whatever happened next would change everything. My name is Derek Thornton, and that was the night I stopped waiting for my family to understand me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days later, I stood in the lobby of the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland, watching rain streak down the tall windows while my sister's engagement party unfolded inside the ballroom. The invitation had arrived by email, forwarded through my mother with a short note attached. Your father thinks it would be good if you came. Vanessa would appreciate it. No mention of the fight. No acknowledgement of being thrown out. Just an assumption that I'd show up, keep quiet, and pretend the last month hadn't happened. I'd driven up from San Francisco that morning, leaving behind the glass towers and venture capital firms that had consumed my life for the past 6 years. The drive gave me time to think about why I was doing this, why I kept trying to fit into a family that had spent decades making it clear I didn't belong. When I stepped into the ballroom, the noise hit me first. Laughter, clinking glasses, the low hum of a jazz trio near the windows. The space was beautiful in that expensive, understated way Portland venues always managed. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs hanging from iron fixtures, long tables set with white linens and arrangements of autumn leaves. My mother saw me first and offered a tight smile, the kind that acknowledged my presence without quite welcoming it. My father didn't look up from his conversation with a group of men near the bar. He'd seen me. I knew he had. But turning away was his way of reminding me I was here on probation, tolerated but not forgiven. A coordinator with a clipboard intercepted me near the entrance, glancing down at her seating chart with a small frown. She asked my name, ran her finger down the list, then gestured vaguely toward the far side of the room. I followed her direction and found my assigned seat tucked near the service corridor, where waitstaff moved in and out with trays and ice buckets. The main table stretched out in front of me, bathed in warm light from the chandeliers, while I sat in a space clearly meant for people the family wanted present but not visible. I lowered myself into the chair and let out a slow breath, reminding myself why I'd come. Tonight wasn't about blending in. It was about ending a pattern that had followed me since childhood. From where I sat, I could see my sister Vanessa at the center table, glowing in a way that only brides-to-be seemed to manage. She was laughing at something her fiancé said, leaning into him with the kind of easy affection I'd never managed to build with anyone in this family. Colin Barrett sat beside her, tall and composed, wearing a charcoal suit that looked tailored but not flashy. He had the kind of face that people trusted immediately, open and steady, with just enough humor in his eyes to make him approachable. I'd never met him before tonight, but I'd heard plenty. He worked in finance, something corporate and respectable. My father approved of him, which said everything that needed saying. I got up and moved toward the bar, weaving through clusters of guests who didn't recognize me or pretended not to. The bartender asked what I wanted, and I ordered something simple, letting my eyes drift across the room. That's when Colin looked up. For a single suspended second, his gaze locked onto mine, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not confusion exactly, but recognition. The kind of look someone gives when they've seen you before but can't quite place where. His brow furrowed slightly, and he tilted his head just enough that I knew he was trying to work it out. I turned away before he could speak, moving back toward my corner of the room. My life had always existed in two separate worlds that refused to touch. In one, I was the disappointment son who'd walked away from the family business and spent years drifting through what my father called pointless tech nonsense in California. Someone my relatives described in vague, apologetic terms because they didn't really know what I did or why it mattered. In the other, I lived in glass conference rooms and private investment meetings, surrounded by attorneys and analysts who spoke in terms my family would never understand. Moving between those worlds felt like stepping from one language into another without a translator. People here never questioned why I kept my work private or why I avoided family gatherings for years at a time. To them, it was just more proof that I'd never been serious about anything, that I'd chosen distance over responsibility. They didn't know I'd spent the last 6 years building a portfolio of companies, making investments that turned small operations into industry leaders. They didn't know that every successful deal ended with the same instruction: keep it quiet, let the work speak, and never attach your name to the headlines. Discretion wasn't just professional for me, it was survival. Years ago, when my father's company hit a rough patch, I watched him refuse outside help, insisting the Thorntons handled their own problems. He turned down investors, ignored advisors, and blamed everyone but himself when contracts fell through. I'd offered to help back then, fresh out of business school with ideas he dismissed as naive. He told me I didn't understand how real business worked, that I was too young and too arrogant to see the bigger picture. So I stopped offering. I went to California, and I built something he would never see coming. 3 years ago, Thornton Industrial Solutions nearly collapsed. The company my grandfather started, the one my father had spent decades running, almost went under because Richard Thornton refused to adapt. He blamed the market, the competition, the economy. Everyone but himself. When a venture capital firm approached him with a buyout offer, he took it without reading the fine print, desperate to keep the doors open and his pride intact. He never asked who owned the firm. He never looked past the immediate cash infusion to see the larger structure behind it. The firm that bought 70% of his company was a subsidiary of a holding group I controlled. My father had been working for me for 3 years and he had no idea. Seeing Colin now stirred something I hadn't expected. I recognized him from board meetings, the quarterly reviews where portfolio CEOs presented their financials and strategic plans. He was the CFO of one of my mid-tier acquisitions, a logistics company I'd bought 2 years ago and turned profitable within 18 months. We'd sat across from each other in conference rooms, discussed projections and market expansions, shook hands after approvals. But those meetings happened in San Francisco, in buildings where my last name never came up, where I was listed in documents as part of an investment group, not as Derek Thornton from Portland whose father ran an industrial equipment company. The connection between those two versions of me had never needed to exist. Until tonight. I watched Colin lean toward Vanessa, saying something that made her laugh, but his eyes kept drifting back to me. He was trying to place me, working through memory like someone solving a puzzle they knew had an answer. I could see the gears turning. The bartender handed me my drink, and I murmured a thanks, using a phrase I'd said 1,000 times in boardrooms. Appreciate it, we're all set here. It was a small thing, a nothing phrase, but Colin's head snapped up. His glass tilted in his hand, and he stared at me with an expression I'd seen before on executives who suddenly realized they'd miscalculated something important. Portland looked almost romantic under the soft lighting of the ballroom. The rain outside blurred the city lights into streaks of gold and white, and the jazz trio played something slow and warm. It could have been a perfect evening, the kind of celebration families were supposed to enjoy together. But every few minutes, someone reminded me exactly where I stood in this hierarchy. A cousin wandered over and joked that I looked lost, asking if I needed help finding the exit. Another relative, one of my father's old business partners, clapped me on the shoulder and said it was good I'd finally shown up to support the family, as if my absence had been some personal failing rather than a reaction to being thrown out. Then my Aunt Diane drifted past and made a comment about how nice it must be to have free time now that I wasn't tied down to real work. She said it lightly, almost kindly, but the implication was clear. I'd spent years doing nothing of value while my father carried the weight of actual responsibility. I stayed quiet, the way I'd learned to do in rooms where speaking up only made things worse. Silence had always served me better than protest. The years spent in negotiations and investor meetings had trained me well in that. At the bar, I asked the bartender to start a new round for the main table, telling him we needed to refresh before the toasts began. The phrasing slipped out before I could stop it. We need to move on this before we lose momentum. Colin, standing a few paces away, froze. His expression shifted from confusion to something closer to alarm, and he set his glass down with a carefulness that didn't match the casual energy of the party. I turned before he could approach, but my cousin Brandon intercepted me, grinning as he waved a phone in my direction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He asked loudly if I could help him figure out why his Bluetooth kept disconnecting, since I was the tech guy in the family. A few people nearby chuckled. I forced a smile and suggested he restart his phone, then excused myself before he could ask anything else. I could feel Colin's eyes on me, tracking my movement across the room with an intensity that didn't belong at an engagement party. He looked pale, unsettled, like someone trying to reconcile two versions of reality that shouldn't exist in the same space. I returned to my seat near the service corridor, hoping the shadows and distance would give me a few minutes of peace. The laughter from the center tables grew louder, sharper, and I recognized the tone. It was the same one I'd heard my whole life. Warm on the surface, cutting underneath. My father's voice rose above the others, telling a story about the early days of his company, back when he'd built it with his own hands and no one else's help. People listened with the kind of attention reserved for men who commanded rooms, and I felt the familiar ache of being invisible in a space filled with my own family. Colin kept staring. Not in the way a groom-to-be glances at wedding guests, but with the focused intensity of someone working through a problem they couldn't afford to get wrong. His jaw tightened, and I saw him lean toward one of the men at his table, a guy I vaguely recognized from family introductions earlier. They spoke quietly, and the other man's eyes flicked toward me, narrowing slightly. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what Colin was saying. He thought he recognized me. He thought I looked like someone from his work life, from boardrooms and investor meetings, but it didn't make sense because that person couldn't possibly be here. When I stood to move toward the restroom, I passed close enough to their table that I caught a fragment of Colin's voice, low and uncertain. He was telling the other man that I reminded him of someone from a major investment review, someone senior, someone whose approval he'd needed to keep his job. The other man laughed it off, saying I was just Vanessa's brother, the one who'd gone out west and never really made anything of himself. Colin didn't laugh. He looked at me again, and this time there was something close to panic in his eyes. I kept walking, but my pulse had shifted into the steady, controlled rhythm I used during tense negotiations. The kind of calm that came from knowing exactly how much power you held and choosing not to use it yet. I'd spent years keeping these two worlds separate, and now they were colliding in the worst possible place. The ballroom felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier, and I understood that the silence I'd maintained for so long was beginning to crack. I moved through the ballroom like someone navigating a minefield, each step measured, each interaction calculated to reveal nothing. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the tall windows in a rhythm that almost matched my heartbeat. I found myself near the dessert table, pretending to examine the arrangement of tiny cheesecakes and chocolate truffles, while actually watching the room's reflection in the polished silver serving tray. Colin was still staring. His fiancée, my sister, had noticed his distraction and was tugging gently at his sleeve, trying to pull his attention back to the celebration. He smiled at her, said something reassuring, but his eyes kept returning to me with an urgency that made my chest tighten. The thing about living a double life is that you become exceptionally good at reading rooms. You learn to notice the small shifts in energy, the way conversations pause when you approach, the glances that linger a half-second too long. I'd spent 6 years perfecting that skill in boardrooms where millions of dollars hung on my ability to read what people weren't saying. Now I was using those same instincts at my sister's engagement party, and what I saw made it clear that my time was running out. Colin wasn't just curious anymore. He was connecting dots, pulling together fragments of memory, and getting closer to a truth that would shatter the carefully constructed narrative my family had built about who I was. My father appeared at the edge of my vision, moving through the crowd with the confident ease of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. Richard Thornton had always carried himself that way, even during the years when his company was hemorrhaging money and he was too proud to admit it. He wore a navy suit that looked expensive but slightly outdated, the kind of thing a man buys when he wants to project success without actually understanding current style. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and he'd gained weight around his middle, but he still had that commanding presence that made people listen when he spoke. He was holding court near the bar, telling another story about the old days, and I could hear the nostalgia in his voice, the way he shaped his past into legend. What my father didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that every dollar keeping his company afloat came from decisions I made in conference rooms 3 states away. When he'd signed those papers 3 years ago, desperate to avoid bankruptcy, he'd been so focused on the immediate cash infusion that he'd never looked deeper. The venture capital firm had a generic name, the kind that appeared in hundreds of business filings across the country. Apex Strategic Holdings. Sounded legitimate, anonymous, forgettable. My attorneys had designed it that way specifically so that men like my father would sign without asking questions. The 70% stake we'd acquired gave me controlling interest, but the operational structure let him keep his title, his office, his illusion of authority. He still showed up every day believing he ran Thornton Industrial Solutions. He still made decisions, approved contracts, managed employees. He just didn't realize that every major strategic direction, every significant financial decision, every acquisition or divestment that kept the company profitable, came from a board he'd never met, following guidance from an investor he'd never seen. I'd watched the quarterly reports for 3 years, tracking his performance from a distance. The company had stabilized, then grown, then actually started thriving in ways it never had under his sole leadership. We'd brought in better management, streamlined operations, cut the dead weight he'd been too sentimental to eliminate. Richard Thornton took credit for all of it, naturally. He told people he'd turned the ship around through sheer determination and business savvy. He never mentioned the capital infusion, the restructuring, the outside guidance that had saved him from his own stubbornness. And I'd let him believe it. Part of me had wanted him to succeed, even if he'd never know I was the one who'd made it possible. Part of me had hoped that maybe, if his company survived, he'd soften. That maybe he'd look at his children and realize there were more important things than business legacy and family reputation. That hope had died the night he kicked me out. The fight had started over something small, a comment I'd made at dinner about Vanessa's wedding plans. She'd been talking about the venue, the cost, the elaborate details, and I'd suggested maybe they didn't need to spend quite so much. It wasn't criticism, just an observation, but Vanessa had taken it personally. She'd accused me of being jealous, of trying to ruin her happiness because I'd never managed to build a life worth celebrating. The accusation had stung more than I wanted to admit, and I'd responded poorly, pointing out that maybe if she'd worked for anything herself instead of living off Dad's generosity, she'd understand the value of money. The fight had escalated from there. My father had risen from his chair with that cold fury I remembered from childhood, the kind that didn't need volume to convey rage. He told me I had no right to criticize Vanessa, that I'd done nothing but disappoint this family since the day I'd walked away from my responsibilities. When I tried to argue, tried to explain that I had built something, that I'd succeeded in ways they didn't understand, he'd cut me off. He said if I couldn't apologize to my sister and mean it, if I couldn't show proper respect for this family, then I could leave his house and not come back. So I'd left. I'd packed my bag, walked out into the night, and driven back to San Francisco without looking back. For 3 weeks, I'd thrown myself into work, taking meetings, reviewing portfolios, making acquisitions. I told myself I didn't care, that I was better off without their judgment and contempt. But when the engagement party invitation arrived, forwarded through my mother with that brief, pointed note, I'd found myself booking a hotel room in Portland and making the drive north. I told myself I was coming to prove something, to show them they were wrong about me. But standing here now, watching my father laugh with his friends while I sat excluded in the shadows, I understood the truth. I'd come because I still wanted them to see me. Even after everything, even knowing it would probably end badly, I wanted my family to understand that I wasn't the failure they believed me to be. Colin had moved away from the main table and was heading in my direction with the determined walk of someone who'd made a decision. His face was pale, his expression tight, and I could see the moment he decided to confront whatever suspicion was eating at him. I considered walking away, disappearing into the crowd before he reached me, but something made me stay. Maybe I was tired of running. Maybe I wanted this conversation, wanted someone in this room to finally recognize what I'd become. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that we could speak without being overheard, and his voice came out strained and uncertain. "Excuse me," he said, and I could hear him struggling to keep his tone casual. "I'm sorry to bother you, but have we met before? You look incredibly familiar, and I've been trying to place it all evening." His eyes searched my face, looking for confirmation, for any sign that would validate what he was thinking. I held his gaze and kept my expression neutral, the way I'd learned to do when investors asked questions I didn't want to answer. I told him we hadn't met, that I'd been living in San Francisco for years and this was my first time back for a family event in a while. It wasn't a lie technically. We hadn't met as Derek Thornton, brother of the bride. We'd met in conference rooms where I was listed in documents as part of an investment group, where my face appeared on video calls as one of several decision makers, where my name was never spoken aloud. Colin's frown deepened. He shook his head slowly, clearly unsatisfied with my answer. No, he said, more insistent now. I've definitely seen you before. Do you work in finance? Tech? Maybe venture capital? Each question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of recognition across his face. I could see him getting closer, assembling the pieces, and I knew I had seconds to decide whether to shut this down or let it play out. Before I could respond, Vanessa appeared at Colin's side, slipping her arm through his with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She glanced between us, sensing tension she didn't understand, and asked if everything was okay. Colin hesitated, then told her he was just introducing himself to her brother, trying to get to know the family. Vanessa's smile tightened. She looked at me with the same expression I'd seen 1,000 times growing up, the one that said I was an obligation she'd rather avoid. She told Colin not to bother, that I wouldn't be staying long anyway since I never really stuck around for family things. The casual cruelty in her voice was almost impressive in its efficiency. She'd managed to dismiss my entire existence in a single sentence, reducing me to someone too unreliable to matter. Colin looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting that kind of hostility, and he started to say something diplomatic about family being important. Vanessa cut him off, steering him away with a gentle hand and a comment about needing to greet other guests. As they walked away, Colin looked back over his shoulder at me, and I saw the wheels still turning in his mind. He wasn't done with this. He was just waiting for the right moment to figure it out. I moved to the windows, pressing my hand against the cool glass and watching rain stream down in rivulets that caught the city lights. Portland spread out below, a grid of streets and buildings I'd grown up in but never really belonged to. Somewhere out there was the house where I'd spent my childhood, the office where my father still went every morning, the life I'd walked away from because staying meant suffocating under expectations I could never meet. And somewhere south down the coast in San Francisco was the life I'd built in secret, the one that gave me power these people couldn't imagine. Standing between those two worlds felt like standing on a fault line, waiting for the earthquake that would split everything open. My Uncle Gerald wandered over, drink in hand, wearing the kind of jovial expression that usually preceded an insult disguised as humor. He asked how I was doing, if I was still out in California playing around with computers. I told him I was doing well, keeping my answer vague and non-committal. He laughed and said that was good, that it was nice I'd found something to keep me busy even if it wasn't real work like what my father did. The comment landed exactly as he'd intended, a reminder that in this family's eyes, anything that didn't involve manufacturing or traditional business was essentially a hobby. I smiled and nodded, letting him have his moment of superiority, while mentally calculating that the portfolio company I'd reviewed just last week had revenue that exceeded his entire lifetime earnings. The room was filling up as more guests arrived, and the energy shifted from cocktail hour to the main event. Waiters began directing people toward their seats for dinner, and I watched the choreographed movement of bodies finding their assigned places. The main tables filled up quickly, families clustering together, friends finding friends, everyone settling into the social hierarchy the seating chart had established. I remained near the windows until a coordinator approached and gently suggested I find my seat. When I returned to the table near the service corridor, I found I wasn't alone. 3 other people had been assigned to the exile table with me. An elderly couple I didn't recognize, probably distant relatives, and a young woman who introduced herself as a college friend of Vanessa's who'd arrived late and gotten stuck with whatever seat was left. We made awkward small talk while waiters delivered the first course. The elderly couple asked what I did for work, and I gave them the same vague answer I'd been using all night. Something in tech, based in San Francisco. They nodded politely and didn't press further, clearly not interested enough to dig deeper. The young woman asked how I knew Vanessa, and when I told her I was her brother, her eyes widened slightly. She said she'd heard Vanessa had a brother but had never met him. The implication was clear. I'd been absent enough that even my sister's close friends didn't know I existed. I changed the subject, asking her about school, and let the conversation drift into safer territory. From my position at the margins, I had a perfect view of the main table where my family sat in their positions of honor. My father at the center, holding court, with my mother beside him looking elegant in a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Vanessa and Colin to their right, the happy couple, surrounded by immediate family and the most important guests. My aunt and uncle nearby, cousins scattered at adjacent tables, everyone positioned according to their importance in the family constellation. And me, here in the shadows with the overflow guests and latecomers, exactly where they wanted me. The dinner progressed through its courses, each plate more elaborate than the last. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, watching the room with the detached observation of someone studying a specimen under glass. Between courses, people stood to offer toasts. My father went first, his voice booming with pride as he welcomed Colin into the family and praised Vanessa's accomplishments. He talked about family legacy, about the importance of building something that lasted, about how proud he was that his daughter had found a man who understood the value of hard work and commitment. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. My father talking about hard work and commitment, while running a company that only survived because I'd saved it. My sister, being praised for accomplishments that mostly involved spending our parents' money and looking good in photos. And Colin, the man who worked for one of my companies without knowing it, being celebrated for qualities my father refused to see in his own son. More toasts followed. Friends shared stories, family members offered advice, and through it all Colin kept glancing in my direction. His discomfort was becoming more visible, his smile more strained. At one point, he leaned toward one of the men at his table, someone I'd later learn was his business partner, and they had an intense whispered conversation. The partner looked over at me, his expression shifting from casual interest to sharp focus, and I knew Colin had shared his suspicion. They were comparing notes, trying to place me, and they were getting close. The jazz trio had been replaced by a DJ, and the music shifted from background ambience to something more energetic. People began moving toward the dance floor, loosened by wine and the festive atmosphere. I stayed seated, content to remain invisible, but my Aunt Diane had other ideas. She appeared at my table with a wide smile and an insistence that I come say hello to some people. Before I could protest, she was guiding me toward a group near the bar, introducing me to business associates of my father's with a kind of forced enthusiasm that made everyone uncomfortable. They shook my hand politely and asked the standard questions about what I did and where I lived. When I mentioned San Francisco, one of them perked up and said he had clients out that way, that the tech scene was incredible these days. He asked if I was involved in any startups or investments. I felt the ground shifting beneath me, the careful separation between my two lives beginning to erode. I gave him a non-committal answer about doing some consulting work, keeping it vague enough to be meaningless. But he pressed further, genuinely interested now, asking about specific companies or sectors. I deflected again, and that's when Colin appeared at the edge of the group. He'd been listening, and something in my deflection had triggered another memory. His face had gone from pale to nearly white, and I watched him work through the recognition like watching someone solve an equation in real time. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again. The moment Colin's expression shifted from confusion to dawning realization, I knew my carefully maintained separation was collapsing. He excused himself from the group with the kind of abruptness that suggested he'd just remembered something urgent, and I watched him navigate through the crowd toward the hallway that led to the restrooms and private meeting rooms. His business partner followed a few steps behind, and I could see from their body language that they needed privacy for whatever conversation was about to happen. I gave them a 30-second head start, then excused myself from my aunt's circle of business associates, murmuring something about needing air. The hallway was quieter, insulated from the party noise by heavy doors and thick walls. I could hear Colin's voice before I saw him, low and intense, coming from an alcove near the hotel's business center. He was on his phone, and the fragments I caught made my pulse quicken. He was talking to someone from his office, asking them to pull up meeting records from the last quarterly review. I heard him say my physical description, Heard him ask about the senior investors who'd been on the video conference, heard the desperation in his voice as he tried to confirm what his memory was telling him. I moved past the alcove without slowing, heading toward the men's room, but I'd heard enough to know that my time was running out faster than I'd anticipated. Inside the restroom, I stood at the sink and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at me was the same one that appeared on video calls with portfolio companies, the same one that sat across from CEOs and CFOs in glass-walled conference rooms, the same one that signed acquisition documents worth tens of millions of dollars. But here, in this hotel in Portland, that face belonged to Derek Thornton, the disappointing son who'd walked away from his responsibilities and never amounted to anything. The cognitive dissonance was almost funny. Almost. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to decide whether I should leave now, before this situation deteriorated further, or stay and see it through to whatever conclusion was building. The decision was made for me when Colin pushed through the door, his partner trailing behind him. They both stopped when they saw me, and the recognition on Colin's face was now absolute and undeniable. He stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths, and I could see him trying to reconcile the impossible. His fiancé's estranged brother, and the senior investor who held approval authority over his company's strategic initiatives. Two people who shouldn't exist in the same space in the same body at the same family event. His partner, a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes and an expensive watch, looked between us with growing comprehension. Colin's voice came out strained and careful, like he was testing words on thin ice. The quarterly review in March, he said. The acquisition proposal for the Seattle Distribution Center. You were on that call. You asked about the environmental impact assessment and the projected labor costs. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and the certainty in his voice told me he'd already confirmed it with whoever he'd called. His partner's eyes widened, and he took a small step back, as if putting physical distance between himself and whatever revelation was unfolding. I met Colin's gaze and didn't deny it. There was no point. The wall between my two lives had just crumbled, and trying to rebuild it now would only make things worse. I asked him if his assistant had been able to pull up the records. He nodded slowly, his face still pale, and said she'd sent him screenshots from the meeting minutes. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and showed me the screen. There was my name, listed among the investment group representatives who'd attended the quarterly review. Derek Thornton, Principal, Apex Strategic Holdings. Below that was a note about my questions regarding the Seattle acquisition, my recommendation to proceed with enhanced environmental compliance, my approval of the expansion timeline. The documentation was clear and irrefutable. Colin's thumb scrolled down to another screenshot, this one showing the ownership structure of his company. Apex Strategic Holdings controlled 62%. I controlled Apex Strategic Holdings. His partner spoke for the first time, his voice quiet and measured. You're telling me that Vanessa's brother, the guy they've been treating like a screw-up all night, is one of the primary investors in our company. Colin nodded without taking his eyes off me. Not one of the investors, he corrected. Based on the ownership structure, he's the primary investor. He has final approval on all major decisions. The partner looked at me with an expression that mixed respect and disbelief in equal measure. He asked if my family knew, and I shook my head. The movement felt heavy, weighted with 6 years of secrecy and careful separation. Colin's breathing had steadied, but his hands were still trembling slightly as he pocketed his phone. Why, he asked, and the single word carried the weight of a dozen questions. Why keep it secret? Why let them treat me like this? Why come to the party at all if I knew how it would be? I leaned against the sink and considered how much to tell him, how much truth this moment required. I said that my father's company had been on the verge of bankruptcy 3 years ago, that he'd been too proud to accept help from family but desperate enough to accept it from strangers. Colin's eyes widened further, and I saw him make the connection. Thornton Industrial Solutions. The name that matched mine, the company my father ran, the manufacturing firm that had been acquired by another one of Apex's subsidiaries. I nodded before he could ask. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Colin's partner excused himself, mumbling something about needing to get back to the party, but I suspected he was really giving Colin space to process this privately. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Colin and me alone in the white-tiled restroom that suddenly felt too small and too brightly lit. Colin sat down heavily on the upholstered bench near the door, the kind of seat hotels provide for their older guests who need to rest. He rubbed his face with both hands and let out a long, shaky exhale. When he looked up at me, his expression had shifted from shock to something closer to anger. "Do you have any idea how awkward this is?" he said. His voice was rising, the careful control slipping. "I'm about to marry into your family, and I've spent the last hour watching them humiliate you, while knowing that you literally have the power to destroy my career with a single phone call. I've been sitting at that table, listening to your father talk about business principles and hard work, knowing that his company only exists because you saved it. How am I supposed to go back out there and pretend I don't know this? How am I supposed to look your sister in the eye and not tell her that her entire family is wrong about you?" I told him he didn't have to do anything, that this wasn't his problem to solve. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. This had become his problem the moment he recognized me, the moment he connected the dots between the invisible investor and the dismissed family member. Colin stood up and paced the small space, his dress shoes clicking against the tile. He asked why I'd let it go on for so long, why I hadn't just told them the truth. The question was fair, and I'd asked myself the same thing countless times over the years. Part of me had wanted to prove I could succeed without their validation, that I could build something meaningful without needing their approval or recognition. Part of me had been protecting myself from their judgment, knowing that if they knew the extent of my involvement in their lives, it would feel like control rather than help. But the deeper truth, the one I'd avoided examining too closely, was that I'd been waiting for my father to soften, for my sister to reach out, for someone in my family to look past their assumptions and see me clearly. I'd kept the secret because revealing it would force a confrontation I wasn't ready to have, would require me to acknowledge that the gap between us might be too wide to bridge. Colin listened to my halting explanation and shook his head slowly. He said that waiting for them to change on their own was like waiting for rain in a desert, that some people never looked beyond their own narratives unless forced to. The observation stung because it was true. We stood there in uncomfortable silence until Colin's phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa asking where he was. He glanced at it and sighed, clearly not ready to return to the party but knowing he had no choice. Before he left, he turned to me and said something that caught me off guard. He told me he respected what I'd built, that the work I'd done with his company had been transformative and impressive. But he also said that if I really wanted to change things with my family, I needed to stop hiding. That secrecy might protect me from their judgment, but it also protected them from the truth. He pushed through the door without waiting for a response, leaving me alone with his words echoing in the tiled space. I gave him a few minutes before following, returning to the ballroom where the party had shifted into full celebration mode. The dance floor was crowded now, and the energy had that loose, slightly chaotic quality that comes when people have had enough wine to forget their inhibitions. I made my way back to my table near the service corridor, but the elderly couple had left and the college friend was out dancing with a group of Vanessa's sorority sisters. I sat alone watching the celebration unfold, feeling more isolated than I had all evening. Colin was back at the main table, sitting beside Vanessa with his arm around her shoulders, but I could see the tension in his posture, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. My father took the microphone again, this time to make an announcement about the wedding timeline and to thank everyone for coming. His voice carried that booming confidence I remembered from childhood, the absolute certainty that he was right about everything, that his way was the only way that mattered. He talked about building a legacy, about the importance of family loyalty, about raising children who understood the value of hard work and commitment. As he spoke, his eyes swept the room, touching on Vanessa with obvious pride, skipping over me entirely as if I wasn't there. The omission was so practiced, so automatic, that I doubted he even noticed he was doing it. To Richard Thornton, I had ceased to exist as anything worth acknowledging years ago. What my father didn't know, what he couldn't see from his position at the center of the celebration, was that his entire current reality rested on foundations I'd built. The stability he bragged about, the company turnaround he claimed as his achievement, the financial security that allowed him to pay for this elaborate party, all of it traced back to decisions I'd made in conference rooms he'd never entered. The quarterly profits he celebrated came from restructuring I'd approved. The new contracts he'd signed came from relationships my team had cultivated. The operational efficiencies he touted came from management consultants I'd hired. He was living in a house I'd built while criticizing me for not knowing how to use a hammer. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. I'd spent 6 years protecting him from his own failures, keeping his company alive, preserving the legacy he claimed to value above everything else. And in return, he'd kicked me out of his house for refusing to apologize to my sister. He'd excluded me from family photos, seated me at the overflow table, and introduced me to his friends as an afterthought. The math didn't balance. The equation refused to resolve. I'd given him everything he needed to maintain his self-image, and he'd given me nothing but contempt in return. A cousin I barely knew approached my table, drink in hand, wearing the kind of artificial friendliness that preceded a favor request. He asked if I was still doing computer stuff in California, and when I confirmed I was, he launched into a pitch about an app idea he'd been working on. He wanted to know if I had any contacts in Silicon Valley, anyone who might be interested in investing in something really innovative. I listened to his pitch, which was neither innovative nor viable, and gave him some generic advice about market research and prototype development. He thanked me with a kind of dismissive gratitude that suggested he'd already decided my advice wasn't worth much, and wandered away to find someone more useful. The party continued to swirl around me, a kaleidoscope of motion and noise that I was part of but separate from. I watched my mother dancing with my father, watched Vanessa laughing with her friends, watched Colin trying to appear relaxed while clearly wrestling with the knowledge he now carried. The disconnect between appearance and reality had never felt more stark. These people thought they knew how the world worked, thought they understood who mattered and who didn't. They'd built their hierarchies based on visible markers, traditional success, conventional achievements. They couldn't see the invisible architecture that held their world together, couldn't imagine that power might exist in forms they didn't recognize. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to find an email from my executive assistant in San Francisco. She was forwarding the preliminary numbers from a deal we'd closed earlier that week, an acquisition that would add another mid-sized manufacturing company to our portfolio. The purchase price was more than my father's company had been worth when I'd bought it, and the projected returns were strong. I scanned the numbers with half my attention while watching the party with the other half, living in both worlds simultaneously and belonging fully to neither. The email signature reminded me of a board meeting scheduled for Monday morning, pulling me back toward the life that made sense, the world where my decisions mattered and my contributions were recognized. I was about to put the phone away when another message came through. This one from Colin. It was brief and to the point. Your sister just asked me why I seemed distracted. I told her I wasn't feeling well. I don't know how long I can keep this up. You need to decide what you're going to do. The message carried an unspoken ultimatum. Either I controlled the narrative or eventually it would control me. Either I chose when and how the truth came out or circumstances would choose for me. I typed back a response telling him to enjoy the party, that I'd handle it, but I had no idea what handling it actually meant. I'd spent years avoiding this confrontation, and now it was rushing toward me whether I was ready or not. The DJ announced that it was time for the cake cutting, and the crowd migrated toward the elaborate three-tiered creation near the windows. Vanessa and Colin posed for photos, their hands joined around the knife handle, smiling for the cameras while a professional photographer circled them like a shark. My mother fussed with Vanessa's hair, making sure every angle was perfect, while my father stood back with his arms crossed and a satisfied smile on his face. This was what he'd wanted, what he'd always wanted. A picture-perfect family moment, a celebration of traditional success, a daughter who'd made a good match and would carry on the family name with appropriate dignity. What he'd never wanted was a son who questioned his methods, who saw flaws in his business strategies, who walked away rather than fall in line. I'd been a disappointment from the moment I'd chosen my own path, and nothing I'd accomplished since had changed his fundamental assessment. In Richard Thornton's world, there was one right way to live, and deviation from that path was failure regardless of the outcome. The fact that I'd built something successful meant nothing if it wasn't the kind of success he recognized or valued. The fact that I'd saved his company meant nothing if he didn't know I'd done it. Recognition required visibility, and I'd chosen to remain invisible. But Colin's recognition had changed the equation. Someone now knew the truth, someone who was about to become part of this family, someone who had to maintain relationships with both sides of this growing divide. The secret that had protected me for years had become a liability, a ticking bomb that could detonate at any moment. I watched Vanessa feed Colin a bite of cake, watched the crowd applaud and cheer, and felt the weight of inevitability settling over me like a heavy coat. This night was going to end badly. The only question was how badly, and whether I'd have any control over the fallout. The breaking point came during the speeches. After the cake cutting, my father reclaimed the microphone and announced it was time for family members to share their thoughts about the happy couple. He started by calling up my Uncle Gerald, who delivered a rambling toast about marriage and commitment that got polite laughter in the right places. Then came my Aunt Diane, who shared an embarrassing story about Vanessa's childhood that made everyone smile. One by one, family members took their turn at the microphone, each offering their blessing and wisdom to the couple beginning their life together. I stayed in my seat near the service corridor, assuming I'd be passed over as I had been for everything else that evening. But my mother had other ideas. She caught my eye from across the room and gestured toward the microphone with an expression that mixed encouragement and warning. It was a look I'd seen before, the one that said I'd better participate and participate correctly if I knew what was good for me. My father was already announcing me, telling the crowd that of course Vanessa's brother wanted to say a few words. His tone carried just enough edge to make it clear this was an obligation I was expected to fulfill, a hoop I was meant to jump through to prove I belonged here. I stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me, and made my way to the front. The microphone was heavier than I expected. Or maybe my hands were just unsteady. I looked out at the sea of faces, most of them strangers or distant relatives I barely knew, and tried to find words that would satisfy everyone without revealing anything. I started with the expected pleasantries, congratulating Vanessa and Colin, talking about how happy I was to see my sister so radiant. The words felt hollow in my mouth, scripted and meaningless, but they generated the appropriate murmurs of approval from the crowd. Then I made the mistake of improvising, of trying to add something genuine to the performance. I said that family was complicated, that sometimes the people closest to us were the ones who understood us least. I said that building a life together meant seeing each other clearly, accepting each other fully, not just the parts that were easy or convenient to acknowledge. As I spoke, I could feel the energy in the room shifting, could see my father's expression tightening and my mother's smile becoming more fixed. I was going off script, saying things that could be interpreted in ways they wouldn't like, and they knew it. Colin was staring at me with wide eyes, clearly worried about where this was heading. Vanessa looked confused, uncertain whether I was complimenting her or criticizing the family. I wrapped up quickly, raising my glass in a final toast to the couple, and returning the microphone before I could say anything more dangerous. The applause was polite but uncertain, and I could hear the whispered conversation starting before I'd even made it back to my table. My father's face had gone from proud to stony, and I knew I'd crossed some invisible line. My mother intercepted me before I reached my seat, her hand closing around my elbow with surprising strength. She pulled me aside into a quieter corner near the service entrance and spoke in a low, urgent whisper. "What was that?" she asked. Her carefully maintained composure was cracking, revealing the anger underneath. "You couldn't just give a normal toast, could you? You had to make it awkward and weird and about your issues with this family." I pulled my arm free from her grip and told her I'd just been honest, that marriage required actually seeing the person you were with. She shook her head sharply and said that tonight wasn't about me or my feelings. It was about Vanessa and celebrating her happiness. The implication was clear. My presence was tolerated, but my perspective was unwelcome. I was supposed to smile and clap and fade into the background, not speak truths that made people uncomfortable. Before I could respond, my father appeared, his face red with barely controlled fury. He'd clearly had enough wine to loosen his restraints, but not enough to make him sloppy. He told my mother to go back to the party, that he'd handle this. She hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to witness the confrontation and wanting to maintain appearances, but ultimately she deferred to him as she always had. When she was gone, my father stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the bourbon on his breath, and spoke in a voice that shook with anger. "I knew it was a mistake inviting you," he said. "You can't help yourself, can you? You can't just be supportive and kind for one evening. You have to make everything difficult." You have to turn every family event into a referendum on how badly you think we've treated you. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest, the same feeling I got in negotiations when I realized the other party was negotiating in bad faith. I asked him if he really wanted to have this conversation now, at Vanessa's engagement party in front of all these people. He said we were having it whether I wanted to or not because he was done pretending I was going to change. He told me that I'd always been selfish, that I'd walked away from my responsibilities to this family the moment things got challenging. He said I'd wasted years on pointless ventures in California, while he'd held the family business together through sheer determination. He said I'd never understood what it meant to build something real, to sacrifice for people you loved, to put family above personal ambition. Each accusation landed like a physical blow, and I could feel my carefully maintained control beginning to crack. The part of me that had stayed silent for years, that had swallowed insults and accepted marginalization, was screaming to be heard. I asked him if he wanted to know what I'd actually been doing in California. My voice came out colder than I'd intended, carrying an edge that made him pause. He said he didn't care what I'd been doing, that it was clearly nothing important if I had time to come back here and cause problems. That's when something inside me snapped. The wall I'd built between my two lives, the careful separation I'd maintained for 6 years, suddenly seemed like a cowardice rather than protection. I'd let this man diminish me, had let my entire family treat me like a failure, because I'd been afraid of the confrontation that honesty would require. But standing here now, listening to him recite my failures while having no idea what I'd actually accomplished, I realized I was done being afraid. I told him I wanted to show him something. Before he could protest, I pulled out my phone and opened the email from my assistant, the one with the acquisition numbers. I handed him the phone and watched his face as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He squinted at the screen, his expression shifting from anger to confusion as he read the corporate names, the financial figures, the legal language of business deals worth more than he'd made in his entire career. He asked what this was supposed to prove, why he should care about some random company acquisition. I took the phone back and opened another email, this one from 3 years ago, archived but still accessible. It was the final documentation of the Thornton Industrial Solutions acquisition, the 70% stake purchase that had saved his company from bankruptcy. His face went pale as he read his own company's name in the documentation. He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between disbelief and dawning horror. I asked him if he remembered signing those papers, if he remembered being so desperate to save his business that he'd accepted help from a venture capital firm without asking questions about who owned it. His mouth opened and closed without sound, and I could see him trying to process what I was showing him, trying to understand how these pieces fit together. I told him very quietly that Apex Strategic Holdings was mine, that I'd built it from nothing over 6 years, that I controlled a portfolio of companies worth more than he could imagine. And then I told him the part that I knew would destroy him. I told him that every major decision in his company for the last 3 years had required my approval. Every expansion, every new contract, every strategic initiative that he'd claimed as his own achievement had only happened because I'd signed off on it from 3 states away. The company turnaround he was so proud of, the financial stability he bragged about, the success he attributed to his business acumen, all of it existed because I'd saved him from his own stubbornness. I told him I'd watched him take credit for work I'd orchestrated, had listened to him lecture me about business failure while running a company that only survived because of my intervention. The color had completely drained from his face. His hand trembled as he reached for the wall to steady himself, and for a moment I thought he might actually collapse. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He asked why, and the single word carried more weight than all his earlier accusations combined. Why had I saved his company if I thought so little of him? Why had I kept it secret? Why was I telling him now? I said I'd saved the company because despite everything, he was still my father, and I hadn't wanted to watch him lose the legacy he'd spent his life building. I'd kept it secret because I knew if he'd known the help was coming from me, his pride would have made him refuse it. And I was telling him now because I was done letting him define my worth based on his ignorance. The noise from the ballroom seemed very distant suddenly, muffled and surreal. We stood in that quiet corner near the service entrance, father and son, with 6 years of secrets between us and no clear path forward. I could see him struggling to reconcile the son he'd dismissed with the investor who controlled his company's fate. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful to watch. He tried to speak several times, sentences starting and dying before they could form. Finally, he managed to ask if anyone else knew. I told him Colin had figured it out earlier in the evening, that keeping it secret was becoming impossible, that eventually everyone would know. That seemed to break through his shock. His face flushed red again, and the anger returned with renewed force. He said I'd made him look like a fool, that I'd manipulated him and lied to him for years. I pointed out that I'd never lied. I'd simply not volunteered information he'd never asked about. He said that was semantics, that deception by omission was still deception. I asked him what he would have done if I'd told him 3 years ago that I was offering to save his company. Would he have accepted help from the son he'd already written off as a failure, or would his pride have driven him to refuse regardless of the consequences? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. We both knew that if I'd come to him openly, he would have rejected the offer and lost everything rather than accept help from someone he deemed unworthy. The truth was that my deception had been necessary, that the only way to save him had been to hide who was doing the saving. But knowing that didn't make it feel any less like betrayal, didn't make the look on his face any easier to witness. I'd spent 6 years building power in secret, and now that the secret was out, I had no idea how to handle the aftermath. My mother appeared at the edge of my vision, moving toward us with quick, worried steps. She'd clearly noticed something was wrong, had seen my father's pale face and recognized distress. She asked what was happening, her eyes darting between us with growing alarm. My father couldn't seem to find words, so I told her simply that I just explained what I actually do for a living. Her expression shifted from concern to confusion, and I realized I'd have to go through the whole explanation again. I pulled up the same emails on my phone, showed her the same documentation, watched her face go through the same progression of emotions my father's had. But my mother's reaction diverged in an unexpected direction. After the initial shock, her expression transformed into something calculating. She grabbed my arm with both hands, her grip tight and urgent, and asked why I hadn't told them sooner. Not with anger like my father, but with a kind of desperate excitement. She said if she'd known about my success, about my position, she could have introduced me to so many people, could have opened so many doors. I pulled away from her grip and told her that the point was I didn't need her to open doors. I'd already opened them myself. But she wasn't listening, her mind already racing ahead to implications and opportunities. She turned to my father and said this changed everything, that we needed to tell people, that having a son with this kind of success and influence was something to celebrate. The enthusiasm in her voice made my stomach turn. This was exactly what I'd feared, exactly why I'd kept the secret for so long. They didn't care about what I'd actually accomplished or what it had cost me to build. They cared about what it could do for them, how it reflected on them, what social currency it provided. My success was only valuable to them insofar as it enhanced their own status and reputation. The realization shouldn't have hurt as much as it did, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were very different experiences. I told my mother there was nothing to announce, that my work required discretion and I wasn't going to compromise that for social advantage. She looked genuinely confused by my refusal, unable to understand why I wouldn't want to leverage my success for family benefit. My father had regained some composure, enough to tell my mother to stop, that this wasn't something to celebrate. His voice carried a bitterness that was new, directed not at me but at the situation, at the uncomfortable truth that he'd been living on my charity without knowing it. He said he needed time to think, to process what this meant, and walked away without looking at either of us. My mother watched him go with frustration written across her face, then turned back to me with an expression that mixed hurt and accusation. She asked how I could have let them suffer through those difficult years when the company was failing, how I could have watched and done nothing. The revision of history was stunning in its audacity. I reminded her that I had done something, that I'd saved the company, that the only reason it was still operational was because I'd intervened. She waved that away impatiently and said I should have told them, should have been honest, should have let them know I was in a position to help. The idea that my honesty would have resulted in rejection didn't seem to occur to her, or if it did, she dismissed it as irrelevant. Colin appeared in the hallway, looking for us with an expression of barely contained panic. He'd clearly noticed the family drama unfolding, and had come to either help or limit the damage. When he saw my face, saw my mother's agitation and my father's absence, he seemed to understand that the secret was out. He approached carefully and asked if everything was okay, and the absurdity of the question in context almost made me laugh. My mother immediately latched onto him, asking if he'd known about my business success, about my position, about any of this. Colin hesitated, clearly trying to navigate between loyalty to his future wife's family and honesty about what he'd discovered earlier. He admitted he'd only figured it out tonight, that he'd recognized me from business meetings and had been trying to reconcile that recognition all evening. My mother asked why he hadn't said anything, and Colin responded with admirable directness that it hadn't been his place to reveal someone else's professional life, that he'd assumed if Derek wanted the family to know, Derek would have told them himself. The simple logic of his response seemed to stump my mother momentarily. She looked between us, trying to find someone to blame for her own lack of knowledge, unable to accept that the fault might lie in years of not bothering to ask her son about his life with any genuine interest. Vanessa appeared behind Colin, drawn by the cluster of family members in the hallway when she should have been celebrating in the ballroom. She looked beautiful in her engagement dress, radiant and happy, and I felt a pang of guilt for disrupting her evening. She asked what was going on, why everyone was standing in the hallway looking so serious. My mother opened her mouth to explain, but I cut her off. I told Vanessa that we'd just been having a family discussion, that it wasn't important, that she should get back to her party. But Vanessa wasn't stupid, and she could read the tension in the air as easily as anyone. She looked at Colin for explanation, and I saw him struggle with how much to reveal. Before he could decide, my father returned carrying a drink that was mostly bourbon and very little ice. He'd clearly fortified himself at the bar before coming back to continue the conversation. He walked straight to Vanessa and told her she deserved to know what kind of person her brother really was. The accusation in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt my jaw tighten. Vanessa looked between us with growing alarm, asking what he meant. My father said I'd been lying to the family for years, manipulating them, controlling them without their knowledge or consent. Each word was chosen for maximum damage, designed to paint me as villain rather than savior. I asked him if he'd prefer I'd let his company fail, if he'd rather be bankrupt and unemployed right now instead of running a successful business. The question landed hard, and his face flushed darker. Vanessa demanded to know what we were talking about, and Colin gently tried to explain that I worked in venture capital, that I'd been quite successful, that there was some family business overlap that had only just come to light. He was trying to soften it, trying to present the facts in a way that wouldn't destroy the evening completely, but my father wasn't interested in softness. He told Vanessa that I owned his company, that I'd bought controlling interest 3 years ago and had been secretly managing it ever since. He said I'd made him into a puppet, a figurehead with no real power, someone who showed up every day to implement decisions made by committees he'd never met. The characterization was unfair and he knew it, but facts mattered less than narrative in moments like this. Vanessa stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between shock and betrayal. She asked if it was true, and I told her the basic facts were accurate though the interpretation was skewed. I'd saved Dad's company when it was failing, had provided the capital and expertise needed to turn it around, and yes, that meant I had controlling interest. Vanessa asked why I'd never said anything, and I gave her the same answer I'd given my father. Because honesty would have resulted in rejection, because pride would have prevented acceptance of help, because the only way to save what needed saving was to do it quietly. She shook her head slowly, processing information that didn't fit with her understanding of family hierarchy. In her world, I was the screw-up older brother who'd never accomplished anything worth noting. Learning that I'd actually been successful enough to save our father's business required a complete recalibration of reality. She asked what else I'd been hiding, what else the family didn't know about my life. I could have left it there, could have limited the revelation to just the business holdings. But something in her tone, the assumption that I'd been deceiving them maliciously rather than protecting myself, pushed me past caring about consequences. I told her about the full extent of my portfolio, about the other companies I controlled, about the deals I'd closed and the investments I'd made. I pulled up more documentation on my phone, showing acquisition announcements and board positions, letting her see the scope of what I'd built, while they'd been dismissing me as irrelevant. With each new piece of evidence, her eyes grew wider, her understanding of her brother dissolving and reforming into something she didn't recognize. My mother, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up with a question that revealed her priorities with stunning clarity. She asked if this meant I could help with the wedding costs, since Vanessa and Colin were planning such an expensive celebration. The mercenary practicality of the question, asked in the middle of this emotional revelation, was so perfectly characteristic that I almost admired it. Before I could respond, my father exploded. He said absolutely not, that he wasn't going to let me buy my way into this family's good graces, that we didn't need my money or my help. The irony of his statement, given that he'd been accepting both for 3 years without knowing it, hung in the air like smoke. Vanessa started crying, and Colin put his arm around her, shooting me a look that clearly said I needed to fix this. But I didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to unmake revelations or reshape perceptions that had been years in the forming. The truth was out, messy and complicated and painful, and there was no putting it back in the box. Other guests had started drifting into the hallway, drawn by the raised voices and visible distress. My Uncle Gerald appeared, asking what the commotion was about. My Aunt Diane was right behind him, her face alight with the kind of curiosity that preceded really good gossip. My father, apparently deciding that if the secret was out it might as well be completely out, announced to the growing crowd that I owned his company. The statement hung in the air for a moment before the questions started coming. How was that possible? When had this happened? What did that mean? Why hadn't anyone known? My mother tried to add her own explanation, talking about my success in California and my investment portfolio, but the narrative was getting away from all of us. People were pulling out phones, presumably to search for my name and my company, trying to verify what sounded like an impossible claim. Colin's business partner, the one who'd been in the restroom earlier, stepped forward and confirmed that I was indeed a significant investor in their company and several others. His verification carried weight because he had no reason to lie, and I watched the crowd's skepticism transform into shocked acceptance. My cousin Brandon, the one who'd asked me to fix his Bluetooth earlier, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. My Aunt Diane's expression had shifted from curiosity to calculation, clearly already thinking about how this information could benefit her. And through it all, Vanessa stood crying while her engagement party dissolved into chaos around her. I'd imagined this moment many times over the years, had played out different versions of how the truth might come to light. In some versions I'd been triumphant, vindicated, finally receiving the recognition I deserved. In others I'd been calm and magnanimous, graciously accepting their apologies and moving forward together as a family. But the reality was messier than any of my imaginings. There was no triumph in watching my father's face as he grappled with having his life's work revealed as charity. There was no vindication in seeing my sister's special evening destroyed by family drama. There was just exhaustion and sadness and the hollow recognition that some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed by truth alone. The party coordinator appeared, clearly stressed about the situation and worried about the venue's reputation. She asked if we could take the family discussion somewhere private, perhaps to one of the hotel's meeting rooms. My father agreed with sharp efficiency, probably relieved to get the spectacle out of public view. We filed into a small conference room off the main hallway. The immediate family plus Colin and his business partner. Someone closed the door, muting the party noise and creating an uncomfortable intimacy. The room was designed for corporate meetings, with a long table and uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired and washed out. My father sat heavily at the head of the table, assuming his usual position of authority out of habit even as that authority was being fundamentally questioned. My mother sat beside him, her face tight with stress and confusion. Vanessa and Colin took seats together, her hand gripping his like a lifeline. I remained standing, too restless to sit, too wound up to pretend at casual conversation. My father demanded to know the full extent of my involvement in his company, wanted details about every decision I'd influenced, every change I'd approved. I told him I didn't have that information memorized, that it was 3 years of quarterly reviews and strategic planning, but that I could provide full documentation if he wanted it. He did want it, demanded it actually, and I sent a message to my executive assistant asking her to compile and forward all relevant materials. My mother asked questions about my other investments, about how I'd built the portfolio, about where the initial capital had come from. I explained about the early tech investments I'd made, about being in the right place at the right time with companies that exploded in value, about using those profits to expand into other sectors. She listened with an intensity that suggested she was looking for flaws in the story, for places where it didn't add up, but the math was simple and verifiable. I'd been smart, lucky, and disciplined, and it had paid off in ways that none of them had imagined possible. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice rough from crying. She asked why I'd never told her, never shared any of this with her. I reminded her of the last real conversation we'd had, 3 weeks ago at the family dinner. I tried to suggest that maybe her wedding budget was excessive, and she'd accused me of being jealous and bitter. I tried to explain that I understood finances better than she thought, and she dismissed me as someone who'd never succeeded at anything. Why would I share the truth with someone who'd already decided I was worthless? The question was harsh but fair, and I watched her flinch from the accuracy of it. Colin spoke up, trying to mediate. He said that clearly there had been misunderstandings on all sides, that maybe everyone needed time to process and adjust their perspectives. My father cut him off, saying this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was deliberate deception. I pushed back, pointing out that I'd never actually lied to anyone. I'd simply maintained privacy about my professional life, which was my right. Just because they'd made assumptions about my success or lack thereof didn't mean I was obligated to correct those assumptions, especially when their treatment of me suggested those corrections wouldn't be welcome. The argument spiraled from there, voices rising and overlapping, accusations and defenses colliding without resolution. My mother tried to play peacemaker while simultaneously trying to understand how this could benefit the family. My father alternated between anger at my deception and humiliation at being saved without his knowledge. Vanessa cried and demanded to know why her engagement party had been ruined. And I stood there, watching my family tear itself apart over truths that should have brought us together, but instead revealed how far apart we'd always been. Finally, I'd had enough. I told them I was leaving, that this conversation was going nowhere productive, that everyone needed time and space to process. My father said that if I left now, I shouldn't bother coming back. The ultimatum was familiar, an echo of the same one he'd given me 3 weeks ago. But this time felt different, more final, weighted with the knowledge we all now shared. I asked him if he was really going to kick out the person who owned his company, if he'd thought through the implications of that threat. His face went pale again, and I saw him realize that the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. He couldn't simply banish me from the family anymore. Not when my financial decisions directly impacted his livelihood. But I didn't want power over my family. I'd never wanted that. I'd wanted recognition, respect, maybe even reconciliation. But standing in that conference room, looking at their faces twisted with anger and confusion and calculating self-interest, I realized that none of those things were possible anymore. The revelation hadn't bridged the gap between us. It had only made the gap more visible, had illuminated all the ways we'd failed to understand or support each other over the years. Truth hadn't set us free. It had just made the cage we'd built together more apparent. I told them I'd have my lawyers draw up paperwork to formalize the ownership structure, that my father would receive full disclosure of all decisions made regarding his company over the past 3 years. I told Vanessa I was sorry her party had been disrupted, and I meant it, despite everything. I told my mother that my professional life would remain private regardless of their preferences, that I wouldn't be using my success as a social tool. And I told all of them that I needed time away from this family, that the wounds we'd inflicted on each other tonight wouldn't heal quickly or easily. Then I walked out of the conference room, down the hallway, and out of the Sentinel Hotel into the rainy Portland night. The city looked blurred through the water streaming down, the lights soft and indistinct, and I breathed in the cool air like someone surfacing from deep water. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts, but I ignored it, getting into my car and starting the long drive back to San Francisco. Behind me, the engagement party continued without me, the celebration going on because weddings wait for no one's family drama. Ahead of me was the life I'd built in secret, now exposed but still mine. And between those 2 points was a distance that felt insurmountable, a gap I'd finally stopped trying to bridge. The drive back to San Francisco stretched through the night, 550 miles of wet highway and scattered thoughts. Rain followed me down Interstate 5, relentless and gray, matching the weight that had settled in my chest. I stopped once for gas somewhere near Redding, standing in the fluorescent glare of the station while cold wind cut through my jacket, My phone had finally stopped buzzing around midnight, the flood of calls and messages tapering off as people either gave up or went to sleep. I didn't check any of them. Whatever they had to say could wait until I was ready to hear it, and I wasn't ready yet. I reached my apartment in the South of Market neighborhood just as dawn was breaking over the bay, painting the water in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for how I felt. The building was one of those converted warehouses that tech money had transformed into luxury living spaces, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows. I'd bought it 2 years ago, back when I was still pretending my success didn't matter to me, back when I told myself I was living modestly despite evidence to the contrary. The truth was I liked nice things like the view of the bay and the high ceilings and the sense of having arrived somewhere that mattered. But standing in my empty apartment at 6 in the morning, exhausted and hollowed out from the night before, all that luxury felt like set dressing for a life I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. I showered and changed, then made coffee that I didn't drink, staring out the windows at the city waking up below. San Francisco on a Sunday morning had a particular quality, quieter than weekdays, the streets less crowded with commuters, the pace more human. I watched people walking dogs and couples heading to brunch spots, living ordinary lives that didn't involve owning their father's company or destroying their sister's engagement party. The normalcy of it all felt foreign and appealing in equal measure. I'd spent so long building something extraordinary that I'd forgotten what ordinary even felt like. Around 9, I finally opened my phone and confronted the damage. 43 missed calls, 72 text messages, 15 voicemails. Most were from my mother, a progression from confusion to anger to something that might have been concern. My father had called twice, leaving no messages. Vanessa had sent a series of texts that started coherent and devolved into fragments and emojis that conveyed hurt more effectively than words could. Colin had messaged asking if I was okay, and if we could talk when I was ready. My Aunt Diane had sent a friend request on LinkedIn. That last one almost made me laugh, the shameless opportunism of it, the immediate pivot from dismissal to networking the moment my value became apparent. The only message I read completely was from Colin, sent at 3 in the morning. He'd stayed up late, apparently unable to sleep, and had written out a long message about the aftermath of my departure. The party had continued for another hour before people started making excuses and leaving early. Vanessa had been devastated, her special evening ruined by family drama she hadn't seen coming. My parents had argued in the conference room for another 30 minutes before my mother had convinced my father to return to the celebration and pretend everything was fine. The pretense had fooled no one. Colin had spent the rest of the night fielding questions from confused guests and trying to support Vanessa while processing his own shock at the revelations. His message ended with an observation that stuck with me. He wrote that he'd always respected the investors he worked with professionally, had admired their business acumen and strategic thinking, but he'd never connected that professional respect with personal relationship until last night. Discovering that his fiancé's dismissed older brother was actually one of those respected investors had forced him to confront his own assumptions about worth and achievement. He'd realized he'd been complicit in my family's treatment of me, had accepted their narrative without question because it was easier than challenging people he was trying to build relationships with. He apologized for that, and the apology felt genuine in a way that nothing from my actual family had. I spent Sunday moving through my apartment like a ghost, unable to settle or focus on anything productive. Every surface reminded me of decisions I'd made, purchases I'd justified, the life I'd built in deliberate isolation from the people who should have mattered most. The expensive coffee maker I'd bought because I could afford it. The artwork on the walls chosen by a decorator because I didn't have time to develop my own taste. The furniture that looked great but felt uncomfortable, selected for appearance rather than actual living. I'd created a space that looked successful but felt empty, and I was only noticing it now because the illusion of separation between my two lives had shattered. Monday morning arrived with the indifference of time that keeps moving regardless of personal crisis. I went to the office because I didn't know what else to do, because routine felt safer than sitting alone with my thoughts. The building that housed Apex Strategic Holdings was in the financial district, a glass and steel tower that projected exactly the kind of authority and success that made investors comfortable. My assistant greeted me with her usual efficiency, handing me a schedule for the day and a summary of overnight messages. She didn't ask about my weekend, didn't pry into why I looked exhausted, just provided the information I needed and returned to her desk. I appreciated her professionalism more than she could know. The first meeting was a quarterly review with one of our manufacturing acquisitions, a company in Oregon that made specialized industrial components. The irony of reviewing another Oregon business, the morning after destroying my relationships with my Oregon family, wasn't lost on me. The CEO presented strong numbers, impressive growth, solid projections for the next quarter. I asked the appropriate questions, provided the necessary feedback, approved their expansion plans. The entire time I was aware of performing a role, of being the version of myself these people expected and needed. Derek Thornton, the investor, the decision maker, the person whose approval mattered. Not Derek Thornton, the disappointing son, the excluded brother, the family member who just blown up every relationship that predated his business success. Between meetings, I finally listened to my father's voicemails. The first one, left Saturday night after I'd driven away, was curt and angry. He demanded I call him back immediately, that we weren't finished with this conversation, that I owed the family an explanation and couldn't just run away when things got difficult. The second one, left Sunday afternoon, was different. His voice was quieter, more controlled, but carrying an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify. He said he'd spent the day reviewing the preliminary documents my assistant had sent, the ownership structure and decision history for Thornton Industrial Solutions. He said he needed to talk to me, that there were things he hadn't understood, that maybe they could discuss this like adults instead of screaming at each other in hotel conference rooms. I didn't call him back. Not yet. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Wasn't sure what I'd say when I had it. Part of me wanted to hear an apology, wanted him to acknowledge how he treated me and recognize that his company only existed because I'd saved it. Part of me knew that apologies from men like Richard Thornton were rare and often incomplete, that I'd be disappointed if I expected genuine contrition or emotional insight. Better to wait until I knew what I actually wanted from the conversation than to stumble into it unprepared. Tuesday brought the news I'd been expecting but dreading. My father's resignation from Thornton Industrial Solutions hit the business section of the Portland Tribune, a small article that most people would skip over, but that mattered enormously to anyone who knew our family. Richard Thornton stepping down as CEO after 30 years, citing personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. The official story painted it as a voluntary retirement, a successful businessman choosing to pursue other interests. The reality, which I understood immediately even if the reporter didn't, was that my father couldn't stomach working for a company his son owned. His pride, the same pride that had nearly destroyed his business 3 years ago, wouldn't allow him to show up every day knowing I had final authority over his decisions. My mother called within an hour of the article posting, frantic and accusatory. She wanted to know if I'd forced him out, if I'd threatened him, if this was some kind of revenge for how they treated me. I told her the truth, that I'd done nothing, that this was entirely his decision and I'd only learned about it from reading the news. She didn't believe me or didn't want to believe me, insisted that I must have done something to make him feel he had no choice. I asked her why she automatically assumed I was the villain in this situation, why it was easier to believe I'd manipulated him than to accept he'd made an emotional decision based on wounded pride. She had no answer for that. Just more accusations and demands that I fix what I'd broken. The conversation devolved from there into a recitation of grievances I'd heard my entire life. How I'd always been difficult, always resistant to family expectations, always choosing my own path over what was best for everyone. How I'd embarrassed them by walking away from the business, by moving to California, by keeping secrets instead of being open and honest. How Vanessa's engagement party had been ruined, how people were talking, how the family's reputation had been damaged by my revelations. Each complaint landed with the weight of years behind it, and I realized with sudden clarity that nothing had actually changed. The facts had changed, the circumstances had changed, but their fundamental assessment of me remained exactly the same. I was still the problem, still the one who disrupted family harmony, still the one who needed to apologize and conform and disappear. I told my mother I wasn't going to apologize for saving Dad's company, or for building a successful career. I told her that if they were embarrassed by my success, that said more about them than it did about me. I told her I needed space and time to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with a family that had spent decades treating me as expendable. And then I hung up while she was still talking, cutting off mid-sentence because I was done being lectured about my failures by people who refused to see my successes. Wednesday brought a different kind of call, one I'd been half expecting since Saturday night. Colin asked if we could meet for lunch, somewhere neutral where we could talk without family interference. I suggested a place near my office, a quiet bistro where business meetings happened over good food and reasonable prices. He agreed immediately, clearly eager to have this conversation face-to-face rather than through the filter of phones and text messages. I spent the morning in meetings, distracted and unfocused, wondering what Colin wanted to say, and whether it would make things better or worse. He arrived exactly on time, wearing a suit that marked him as someone important but not ostentatious. We shook hands with the awkward formality of people whose relationship had fundamentally shifted, no longer quite strangers but not yet friends. We ordered food neither of us would eat much of, made small talk about the weather and the restaurant, circling around the real conversation until the waiter left us alone. Then Colin leaned forward, elbows on the table, and asked me directly what I wanted to happen with his company, and with my father's company now that everything was out in the open. I told him honestly that I didn't know. I'd never wanted to be a visible owner, had structured everything specifically to avoid the kind of personal entanglement that was now unavoidable. With Colin's company, things could probably continue as they had been. He knew who I was now, but that knowledge didn't have to change the professional relationship. With my father's company, everything was more complicated. His resignation had created a power vacuum that needed filling, and the board was waiting for direction from me about succession planning. I could install a new CEO, could take more direct control, could even sell the company if I wanted to wash my hands of the whole situation. But any of those choices had implications for my father, for his legacy, for the employees who'd worked there for decades. Colin listened carefully, asking occasional questions, and I realized he was treating this like a business consultation rather than a family drama. He had a gift for separating the emotional from the practical, for seeing problems as puzzles to be solved rather than catastrophes to be endured. He suggested that maybe the answer wasn't choosing between complete control and complete withdrawal, but finding some middle path that acknowledged the complicated reality. What if we brought in outside management but kept my father on as a consultant or board advisor, giving him continued connection to the company without the day-to-day authority that he could no longer handle, knowing I was ultimately in charge? What if we structured things so he could maintain his professional identity while I maintained my ownership? It was a reasonable suggestion, the kind of compromise that made sense on paper. But I wasn't sure it could work in practice, wasn't sure my father's ego would allow him to accept a diminished role, even if it was dressed up with fancy titles. I told Colin I'd think about it, that I appreciated his perspective, that it helped to talk through the options with someone who understood both the business and family dimensions. He nodded and then shifted the conversation to more personal territory, asking how I was doing, whether I was okay after everything that had happened at the party. The question surprised me with its sincerity. I'd expected this lunch to be about business strategy and damage control, not about my emotional well-being. I found myself telling him the truth, that I felt relieved and devastated in equal measure. Relieved that I didn't have to maintain the separation anymore, that the exhaustion of living a double life was finally over. Devastated that the revelation hadn't brought understanding or reconciliation, that my family seemed more interested in how my success affected them than in actually knowing me as a person. I'd spent 6 years building something extraordinary, and the people who should have been proudest of me could only see how it complicated their own lives. Colin was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. Then he told me something I hadn't known, that Vanessa had been up every night since the party, crying and questioning everything she thought she knew about our family. That she'd started asking their mother why they'd treated me so badly, why they'd never asked about my life or shown interest in my work. That my mother had deflected and made excuses, but Vanessa was beginning to see through them, beginning to recognize that the family narrative about me had been incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. He said Vanessa wanted to talk to me, wanted to understand, but was afraid I'd reject her the way she'd rejected me for so long. The information hit harder than I expected. I'd written Vanessa off as hopelessly embedded in my parents' worldview, assumed she'd side with them automatically because she always had before. Learning that she was questioning things, that she was crying over revelations that had shaken her understanding of our family, made her more human and sympathetic than I'd allowed her to be. I asked Colin what he thought I should do, whether reaching out to Vanessa would help or make things worse. He said honestly that he didn't know, that relationships were more complicated than business deals and didn't follow predictable patterns. But he thought we both deserved the chance to have a real conversation, brother to sister, without our parents' interference or expectations. We finished lunch with a plan. Colin would tell Vanessa I was open to talking, and she could reach out when she was ready. No pressure, no timeline, just an open door that she could walk through if she chose to. For his company, we'd maintain the status quo, professional relationships continuing as they had been with the added acknowledgement of who I actually was. For my father's company, I'd take a few days to think through the options Colin had outlined, would consult with my board and my attorneys, would try to find a solution that balanced business needs with human dignity. It wasn't perfect, but it was forward movement, which felt better than the paralysis I'd been stuck in since Saturday night. Thursday and Friday passed in a blur of meetings and decisions that felt both more important and less meaningful than they should have. I approved acquisitions and rejected proposals, reviewed financial reports and strategic plans, performed the role of successful investor, while feeling like an imposter who'd somehow fooled everyone into taking him seriously. The cognitive dissonance between how people treated me professionally and how my family treated me personally had always existed, but now it felt starker, more obviously absurd. The same skills and judgment that made me trustworthy with millions of dollars were apparently worthless when it came to family relationships and personal decisions. Saturday morning, I woke to find a text from Vanessa sent at 2 a.m. It was long and rambling, clearly written in an emotional state without much editing or structure. She said she was sorry for how she treated me, sorry for assuming I'd failed at everything, sorry for not asking about my life with genuine interest. She said our parents had painted a picture of me as someone who'd rejected the family, who'd walked away from responsibility and commitment, and she'd accepted that picture without question because it was easier than challenging them. She said she'd been selfish and shallow and hadn't deserved a brother like me. She said she wanted to talk, to really talk, to try to build something real between us even if it was too late. I read the message 3 times, looking for manipulation or hidden agendas, but found only exhausted honesty. Vanessa had never been good at hiding her feelings, had always been transparently emotional in ways I'd sometimes envied and sometimes found embarrassing. The message read like someone who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths, and was struggling to integrate them into her understanding of herself and her family. I wrote back simply, telling her I'd be willing to talk when she was ready, suggesting we meet somewhere away from our parents where we could have privacy and time. She responded within minutes, agreeing to meet for breakfast the following Sunday at a cafe in Portland that neither of us had family connections to. The week leading up to that meeting felt longer than it should have. I threw myself into work, using business as distraction from the nervousness that built as Sunday approached. I met with my attorneys to discuss options for my father's company, reviewed several succession plans that ranged from complete management overhaul to minimal changes with outside advisors. I talked to the existing board about my father's resignation, gauged their reactions and concerns, tried to assess whether the company could survive the leadership transition without significant disruption. The general consensus was that Thornton Industrial Solutions was healthy enough to weather the change, that my father's contributions had been more ceremonial than essential for the past few years anyway. The assessment was probably accurate but still felt cruel, reducing a man's career to something that could be replaced without much difficulty. I also spent time reviewing my own choices, examining the decisions I'd made over the past 6 years with the kind of critical distance I usually reserved for investment analysis. Had I been right to keep everything secret, or had I been a coward hiding behind privacy and discretion? Had I saved my father's company out of love, or had there been an element of control and revenge in it, a desire to prove something to a man who'd never believed in me? Had I built my success as a genuine achievement, or had I been driven primarily by the need to show my family they were wrong about me? The questions didn't have clean answers, just complicated truths that existed in shades of gray, rather than black and white. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and unseasonable warmth, the kind of weather that felt like a gift after weeks of rain. I drove to Portland early, arriving at the cafe 30 minutes before our scheduled meeting, because I was too restless to wait at my hotel. The place was small and unpretentious, the kind of neighborhood spot that served good coffee and better food without any pretense. I ordered an espresso I didn't need and sat at a table near the window, watching people pass by on the sidewalk and trying to prepare for a conversation I had no script for. Vanessa arrived exactly on time, which surprised me. She'd never been punctual as a teenager, had always operated on her own flexible timeline that frustrated our parents and everyone else who had to wait for her. But she walked through the door at exactly 9, scanning the room until she found me, then approaching with visible nervousness. She looked different than she had at the engagement party, less polished and more human. Her hair was pulled back simply, her clothes casual, her makeup minimal. She looked like someone who'd stopped performing for an audience and was trying to figure out who she actually was underneath all the expectations. We greeted each other awkwardly, neither sure whether to hug or shake hands or just sit down and start talking. Eventually, we settled for slight nods and took our seats across from each other, both ordering coffee neither of us particularly wanted. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Vanessa finally broke it, saying she didn't know where to start. I told her the beginning was usually good, and she laughed nervously, the sound releasing some of the tension between us. She asked if I'd read her text, and I said I had, that her willingness to reach out meant something even if everything was still complicated. She started talking then, words spilling out in a rush as if she'd been holding them back for too long. She said the engagement party had been ruined, but maybe it needed to be ruined because the whole thing had been performative anyway. She and Colin had been planning a wedding that was more about impressing people than about actually celebrating their relationship. Her dress cost more than most people's cars, the venue was chosen for Instagram rather than meaning. The guest list was designed to showcase social connections rather than genuine relationships. The party's destruction had forced her to question all of it, to ask whether she was building a marriage or just staging an elaborate performance. I listened without interrupting, letting her work through thoughts she clearly needed to express. She talked about our parents, about growing up in their shadow and trying to meet their expectations. She said she'd always been the good daughter, the one who followed the rules and made them proud, while I'd been the difficult son who questioned everything. She'd resented me for that, for making things harder, for not just conforming and keeping the peace. But now she was beginning to understand that maybe I'd been right to question, that blind conformity wasn't the same as genuine relationship, that our parents' approval had always been conditional on agreement rather than based on unconditional love. The observations were neither new nor particularly profound, but hearing them from Vanessa mattered in ways I hadn't expected. For years I'd assumed she was completely aligned with our parents' worldview, that she saw me the same way they did. Learning that she'd had her own struggles with their expectations, her own doubts about the family dynamics, made her feel less like an adversary and more like someone who'd been damaged by the same system in different ways. I told her I appreciated her honesty, that I knew it wasn't easy to question the narratives we'd grown up with. She asked about my work then, about how I'd built the business and why I'd kept it secret. I gave her a condensed version of the story, hitting the major points without getting lost in details. The early investments that had paid off, the portfolio that had grown, the decision to save Dad's company from a distance. She listened with genuine attention, asking occasional questions that showed she was actually trying to understand, rather than just waiting for her turn to speak. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd told her. Then she asked the question I'd been avoiding thinking about too directly. She asked if I hated our parents, if I'd done all of this as some kind of elaborate revenge scheme to prove they were wrong about me. The question deserved an honest answer, even if the honesty was uncomfortable. I told her I didn't hate them, but I also didn't particularly like them as people. That I'd spent most of my adult life trying to earn their approval, while simultaneously resenting that I needed it. That saving Dad's company had been motivated by multiple things, love and duty and yes, probably some desire to prove something, all mixed together in ways I couldn't fully untangle. That I'd kept everything secret not because I was ashamed of what I'd done, but because I was tired of being judged and dismissed by people who refused to see me clearly. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to take my hand. The gesture surprised me with its spontaneity and simple affection. She said she wanted to see me clearly now, wanted to know her brother as a real person rather than the caricature our parents had created. She said she didn't expect me to forgive her immediately or trust her automatically, that she understood she'd have to earn both of those things. But she wanted the chance to try, wanted to build something honest between us, even if it took time and effort. I found myself agreeing, telling her I wanted that too, that despite everything, she was still my sister and I still cared about her. We talked for another 2 hours, ranging across topics from childhood memories to current struggles, slowly rebuilding a connection that had been frayed for years. She told me about her relationship with Colin, about how the revelations from the party had actually brought them closer, because it had forced them to be more honest about who they were and what they wanted. I told her about my life in San Francisco, about the loneliness that came with success, about missing connections with people who knew me before I'd made money. By the time we left the cafe, something had shifted between us. Not fixed completely, not transformed into instant closeness, but moved in a direction that felt possible and real. We agreed to stay in touch regularly, to have actual conversations rather than just exchanging pleasantries at family events. She said she'd talked to our parents about their treatment of me, though she wasn't optimistic about their willingness to change. I told her that was okay, that I wasn't expecting or requiring reconciliation with them, that if she and I could build something genuine, that would be enough. The drive back to San Francisco felt different than the drive up a week earlier. Lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of secrets and pretense. I'd lost some things over the past 10 days, the illusion of family unity, the protection of privacy, the careful separation between my professional and personal identities. But I'd also gained things. Honesty primarily. The freedom that came from not having to maintain elaborate deceptions. The possibility of real relationship with my sister. And perhaps most importantly, a clearer understanding of what I actually wanted from my life rather than what I thought I should want. 3 months passed with surprising speed. My father never called to apologize or explain, but through Vanessa, I learned he'd taken my assistant's suggestion and accepted a consulting role with his old company. The arrangement seemed to work for him, giving him continued connection without the daily reminder that I owned what he'd built. My mother had stopped calling entirely, apparently deciding that if I wasn't going to apologize or make things easy, she'd rather have no relationship than a complicated one. The silence from her hurt less than I expected, which probably said something about how damaged that relationship had been all along. Vanessa and I talked every week, sometimes more. She'd scaled back her wedding plans dramatically, choosing a smaller venue and a more intimate guest list. She asked if I'd come, and I said yes without hesitation. Colin and I had settled into an easy professional respect that occasionally tipped into genuine friendship. He'd become a kind of translator between my world and Vanessa's, someone who understood both the business complexity and the family dynamics well enough to navigate between them. The company portfolio continued to grow, new acquisitions and investments expanding the reach of what I'd built. But I'd started making changes to how I approached the work, being more selective about opportunities, prioritizing quality of life alongside profit margins, thinking about legacy in more personal terms than just financial returns. I'd also started being more visible in my role, doing occasional interviews and speaking at conferences, letting people connect Derek Thornton the investor with Derek Thornton the person. The visibility felt uncomfortable at first, exposing me to attention and judgment I'd carefully avoided. But it also felt freeing, like I'd finally stopped hiding from my own success. A year after the engagement party that had changed everything, I stood in my apartment looking out at San Francisco Bay as evening fog rolled in. The view never got old. The way the city transformed as light shifted, the constant movement of water and weather creating endless variations on familiar themes. My phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa, a photo from her honeymoon in Portugal. She and Colin looked genuinely happy, relaxed in a way that suggested they'd built something real rather than just performed something impressive. She'd written that she wished I could have stayed longer at the wedding, that she'd missed me, that she loved me. The message was simple but carried weight that came from being earned rather than assumed. I'd gone to the wedding, had stood beside Colin as one of his groomsmen at Vanessa's request. My parents had been there, of course, polite but distant, maintaining the careful facade they perfected over decades of social performance. We'd exchanged pleasantries and nothing more, and I'd been okay with that. Not happy exactly, but accepting of the reality that some relationships couldn't be repaired just because we wanted them to be. What mattered was that I'd been there for Vanessa, that I'd supported her in building something that belonged to her rather than to our parents' expectations. The sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too vivid to be real. I thought about the Derek Thornton who'd driven to Portland a year ago, carrying the weight of secrets and the hope that maybe, somehow, his family would finally see him clearly. That version of me had been both right and wrong about what would happen. Right that the truth would come out eventually, wrong about how it would unfold and what it would mean. The revelation hadn't brought the vindication or reconciliation I'd imagined. It had brought something messier and more complicated, something that required constant navigation rather than simple resolution. But it had also brought freedom. Freedom from the exhaustion of maintaining separate identities, from the constant calculation required to keep worlds from colliding, from the loneliness that came from being fully known by no one. I was building something different now, a life that integrated success and relationship, professional achievement and personal connection, wealth and meaning. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I'd left Portland 6 years ago, and it wasn't the life my family had wanted for me. But it was mine, built on foundations I'd laid myself, and that had to be enough. I raised my glass of wine to the sunset, to the journey that had brought me here, to the relationships I'd lost and the ones I'd found. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, new opportunities and complications. But tonight, standing in my apartment overlooking the bay, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not quite peace maybe, but something close to it. Acceptance, perhaps. Understanding that life was messy and families were complicated and success didn't solve problems so much as reveal them. And knowing that despite everything, or maybe because of everything, I was exactly where I needed to be. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from my executive assistant about Monday's schedule. Board meetings and investor calls, strategic reviews and acquisition proposals, the endless cycle of business that had become my life's work. I'd respond in the morning. Tonight was for reflection and rest, for acknowledging how far I'd come and how much further I still had to go. The fog had rolled in completely now, obscuring the view, wrapping the city in soft gray silence. I turned from the window and moved deeper into my apartment, into the space I'd built for myself, carrying the lessons of the past year forward into whatever came next. The story of my family would continue without my constant participation in their drama. The story of my business would continue evolving as markets shifted and opportunities emerged. But the story of who I was, separate from their expectations and independent of my achievements, that story was just beginning. And for the first time in my life, I was the only one writing it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.